Greetings sailors and welcome to the Jean Bart again. I've already covered this once. This is still, I think, technically a work in progress. And the change since the last patch was to the main battery reload booster, which initially it basically cut your reload down to a flat 10 seconds over a 30-second period. And then the current iteration is like 50% off whatever your base reload is, so it is in your interest, well, it just is in your interest generally to get the reload down as much as possible. I don't think anything else really changed, but I could be wrong about that, of course. Now, I don't know how much I'm exactly allowed to say, but this isn't necessarily the final form, I'll put it that way. But what I really want to talk about in this video generally, and what I think this replay is a good example of, is when the reload booster works, what Wargaming's kind of thinking is with having it on a battleship, because of course we're going to have the Bourgogne with basically the same thing, and also just the flaws potentially with the concept overall. So this is very good matchmaking for one thing, but there is an enemy Musashi for me to worry about, who is on this side. And one of the defining things about both this and the Bourgogne is that they're both glass cannons. They have smaller caliber guns for their tier. This in particular, it's got that all forward gun configuration, but the Bourgogne's got a rear turret as well. And the Bourgogne especially, it's pretty fragile for being a tier 10, and I think it has the least hit points for being a tier 10 as well. But it kind of makes up for that with the gun performance, and especially when you've got the reload booster on top of that, when you can pump out that extra damage every so often. Although they are fragile, they can become very, very potent damage dealers. As with that, you know, against a normal battleship, that Z46 might have had a chance to move around a bit more in the smoke in between reloads, but because I had the reload booster going, I was able to finish them off. And here's where one of the major problems with the reload booster on a battleship as a concept is: it's battleship caliber guns, and it's not like you're only ever firing them against other battleships. It's particularly punishing for destroyers with the current state of potential full AP penetrations, although that is something Wargaming is working on. That is an issue that they know about and are trying to fix. But of course there's cruisers as well, and even though these are smaller guns for their tier, and there are going to be some cruisers that actually, these are what, like 15-inch guns? There are some cruisers where their armour will be at least somewhat effective against these guns. There are still plenty of cruisers where that's not going to be true, and where you'll be able to punish them really very hard, even if they're not making mistakes. Because one of the big ideas behind this on a battleship is you can punish people who are making mistakes. Just like this Musashi is punishing the Egypt that you're watching right now, who's trying to bow tank against a ship with guns that can easily overmatch basically every armour it has. Which is not really smart of me to try and bow tank against a Musashi, but that's not the point of this replay. So if you're only ever using it against battleships that were making tremendous mistakes, or even cruisers that were making tremendous mistakes, it would be fine. But of course, you're not limited to that. You can just use it anytime you want, essentially. And so, especially against cruisers and destroyers, as I've said, they don't need to be making mistakes to get punished massively. Battleships, on the other hand, kind of do. They have to be giving you broadsides for you to get the most effective use. But even then, you can still get some HE shells in, and even if they're angled, several salvos of battleship HE shells in a row have a fairly good chance of actually setting fires, and even if they don't, you're still going to do some damage and wreck a lot of AA modules. So you can see where Wargaming is coming from with this idea, but of course there's always that disconnect between wouldn't it be a nice idea if we had this, and here's how it might work, to what players actually do when they get their hands on it. In an ideal world, everybody would use the things that you give them in the way that you intend them to be used, but of course that really never holds true ever at all in any field of life pretty much. video games are absolutely no exception. So as I have a bit of a broadside, tried another use of the reload booster, and this was me trying HE shells, but not really getting so lucky. At this range, the AP is not going to be so effective against a Musashi. I mean, the range on this ship is good, but if you're sailing around firing those shells at max range, it's probably not going to be that effective. Now, I've just been lurking behind this island the entire time after a thorough spanking by that Musashi, probably a rather deserved spanking. And at this stage I decided actually I'm going to go and help out those two cruisers that are stopping enemy forces coming around from the other side. And we do seem to have something of the upper hand at the moment, but it is by no means guaranteed. So if I can help secure that flank and maybe even push round afterwards, that would be quite a good thing. And there is the carrier focusing their efforts over there as well, so that's also going to help a lot. Now, there is another factor that's going to be particularly important in how this particular game works out, and that is the fact that the Cyclone is about to hit, which will of course have the effect of bringing the effective fighting ranges down to really quite close quarters indeed. I will say at this point, by the way, I'm in the top tier battleship. I probably, just looking back at this, should have headed south, but at the point where I triggered the speed boost, started heading west, well actually I will trigger a speed boost in a bit, but I wasn't aware of the fact that the carrier was concentrating quite so much attention on this side, although it kind of makes sense that they would be. And so initially, although it looked like, oh yeah, there's two enemy ships, and one of them's a full health Bismarck pushing up around that flank versus a pair of cruisers. It wasn't just a pair of cruisers, it was the carrier as well. And so suddenly it's just the Chapayev, and my presence here seems a whole lot less necessary. Although things are going to work out. They are going to work out. I wouldn't be showing you this replay otherwise. But yeah, looking back, I can definitely see that as the top tier battleship, I probably would have been better going down south and supporting my team that way. But as it is, I'm here now. I've triggered the speed boost again. But I'm not going to get so much of a use out of it this time. The Chapayev slams on their brakes, which helps them for the first salvo, but because my reload is that much quicker, my second one goes out, although I was still thinking they'd be moving forward a little more than that, but nonetheless, 7500, that's not too bad. Third salvo out, the reload booster's about to go, but Battleship RNG is still Battleship RNG at the end of the day, and so that wasn't a lot of damage, all things considered, but it easily could have been, a series of better shots, and this Chapayev could be dead already. As it is, I get a partial effect out of the remainder of the reload booster, given its nature currently in patch 079, and a pair of overhens, never mind. So it's actually the Cleveland that gets the kill. So we've basically taken out the threat on this side. Our team seem to have done quite well on the other side, although visibility is now dropping. And so with the two cruisers, I push around into the A-cap, and we do seem to be very firmly winning at this point. Although we are going to lose quite a few more ships before this is over. They do still have not that many fewer ships than we do. Sometimes this kind of overconfidence when you're winning so thoroughly on points can end up costing you, and it didn't cost me personally, but the team ends up losing quite a few ships in a relatively short span. This is a good moment to admire the AA at work on this ship, by the way. This is the post-refit Jean Bart, which is one of the reasons why it's at tier 9. It has a very, very capable AA suite, and although tier 10 carriers are probably not going to worry about it too much unless you've fully spec'd for AA, it's still pretty respectable. It's still quite good. It's like American levels of AA, I would say. So that Cleveland got spotted a little as we're looking around to try and find the fighters. If the enemy carrier had any torp bombers left, that might have been a problem for me, because the spotting range for aircraft becomes a lot shorter in cyclones, and it can be nasty when you suddenly get a full attack wave of planes coming at you and your AA just doesn't have any time to work on them. But in this case it was just the dive bombers. So here's where the intended purpose of the reload booster comes into play. That's a Musashi. Instead of keeping angled bowing towards me, they're starting to turn away, and that allows me to get some pretty much picture-perfect shots into their citadel. There was a slight complication though. Yeah, that Edinburgh, whom up until this point I'd thought was maybe a somewhat decent player, decided to do that, and if not for a bit of hasty avoiding action. And yeah, you can see I was slightly startled by in the chat, but that could have gone a bit worse for me. As it is, the Edinburgh dies, but that was basically the intended use of the reload booster, is to be able to punish somebody doing something really, really hard. Because it was such close range, that made getting the citadel shots particularly easy. And so that Musashi went from being high health to dead in a pretty short span. And I could do exactly the same thing to this Nelson. My guns are big enough to overmatch the Nelson's armour, because that's a tier 7 battleship. As it is, the reload booster is, I don't think I'm even going to get it back by the time this is finished, but I'm still going to get some more damage out of it. And so I went from a relatively unimpressive, like, what was it, 56k when I started heading over this side. I got a bit out of the Bismarck and I got a bit out of that Chapayev, but it wasn't until I got the Musashi at very close range and was able to use the full power of the reload booster that the damage really jumped up. And if all games with the reload booster were like this, where you're basically punishing people doing stupid things, then that would be fine. But of course, all games aren't going to be like this. So, although this is the ideal scenario, of course, it's also probably going to be the less common scenario. So we've lost all but 3 ships at this point. We lost, yeah, as I said, a lot of people in a very short span of time, but we accumulated such a lead on victory points that it's ended up absolutely not mattering at all. And I've basically cut out the last little bit of this. The enemy cruiser and the enemy carrier get to live, and we basically won on points. So 182,000. I'm sure there are people out there with replays where they've done even better while they were testing this thing. This is with the replay, the reload down to about as good as I can make it. And of course, if you've got adrenaline rush on there as well, losing health actually helps you get even more benefit out of your main reload booster. The surviving ships at the top of the team there, I did quite well XP wise, and overall I felt like, you know, if I could have matches like this where I just get to punish stupid battleships, that would be quite nice. But as I say, it's not going to be just this. It's also going to be, as we saw at the very start, punishing destroyers that don't deserve it, at least for the time being, and also quite potentially punishing cruisers that don't really deserve it, that aren't doing anything wrong other than happening to be where I can see them. And I trigger my reload booster, and a couple of salvos later, RNG willing, blam, they're dead. Not all engagements are going to be, of course, nearly so close range. So my thoughts on the Jean Bart and the Bourgogne are still somewhat mixed, to be quite honest, and it really does come down to the reload booster. The idea of a glass cannon kind of style battleship where it's more fragile for its tier, but you've got perhaps better potency from the guns, is not unappealing. Although I'm not quite seeing the logic of having the Bourgogne and the Jean Bart. I know they're there to serve different roles. One is possibly going to be a coal or free XP ship, and the Bourgogne is almost certainly going to be a steel ship. But basically, they're the same thing, only one's a tier higher and has an extra turret. They're both fulfilling the same role, and it seems slightly redundant having both of them at the same time. But that's kind of a different issue from the reload booster. So, to conclude, I really wouldn't enjoy being on the wrong end of one of these things, especially in a cruiser if I got caught out, even if I didn't get caught out, because, you know, as I say, a lot of cruisers, even at these tiers, you can't really effectively angle against battleship shells. You might get lucky and tank some on the belt, especially at close to the ranges, but further away, when plunging fire is more of a factor, you might be doing everything right and still just get nailed into the ground simply because they have the reload booster and you don't have the time between them reloading to manoeuvre or break contact or whatever. So I'm absolutely still not convinced by the idea of this on a battleship. But we'll see, of course, what it's like when it's ready for release. So that's it for this replay. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and if you did, you can hit the like button, comment, do all the other usual things down under the video, and of course, as always, stay tuned for more.